Okay, so today we will um, discuss about robustness and anti-fragility, and these uh, concepts are tightly related, and we've already touched them. We speak about adaptation. Let's start with robustness. So usually it's related, perhaps more with structure, while adaptivity is related more with function. I mean, we already mentioned this relationship between structure and function of systems that, let's say, it's not obvious if we look at the structure of a system to infer what the functionality might be, or even more, if we want a system to perform a certain function, what kind of structure should it have in order to perform it in the best possible way? Um, so yeah, this relationship between structure and function is like one of the big open questions in science. And we mentioned in the first classes when we spoke about cybernetics, about different types of control, the difference between passive and active control. So um, passive control would be more related to robustness and structure. So in control theory, it's just called buffering. So if you have something like an insulator that dampens perturbations, then let's say that has to do more with the structure than with the function of the system. Passive controller instead of active controller that does something or needs to make a decision or solve a problem. Uh, and in many cases, it's easier or better to build robustness in systems rather than trying to design some active controller. For example, if we have good insulation in a house, then the thermostats will don't have to work so hard. Also, in many cases, it's best to combine both robustness and adaptability. And uh, fragility could say that can be lack of robustness or the opposite of robustness. We'll come back to this. And there are many analogies between fragility and chaos in the sense that there's sensitivity to small changes when something is fragile. We could say that in engineering, we don't want fragility, but in general, it's not sustainable. Something that's too fragile, since we are in a dynamic world and it's not isolated, there are interactions. So if it's fragile, it means that few interactions or small changes will perturb it. So usually it's not sustainable. So by natural selection, usually fragility is not something that persists. Still, many systems we build have certain degree of fragility. And as we saw, as we increase the connectivity or the number of interactions in a complex system, then the fragility tends to increase. So that is something that we are facing with our globalized systems, that information spreads globally, diseases spread very quickly, uh, economic impacts from bad decisions made by uh, dictators on the other side of the planet can have drastic effects globally. And in engineering, we usually try to protect this fragile system. So let's say we have something made of crystal and then we kind of build buffering. So try to make it robust by kind of putting protection around it. In many cases, it's sufficient. The thing is that if the environment is dynamic and we don't know what kind of perturbations the system we are trying to protect will be facing, then sooner rather than later, there will be a perturbation that will go through our defense mechanisms. Um, so an alternative, which is not exclusive but complementary, is let's say, allow the systems to adapt by themselves. And in any case, it's also useful to understand robustness. So it's present in many biological systems precisely because evolution tends to favor robustness because it's sustainable. I mean, by definition. And we observe it at multiple scales from molecules to ecosystems, and we'll give examples at these multiple scales. In engineered systems, not so much. We tend to build systems for function rather than for robustness, and we assume that everything will be perfect. And for example, in factory settings, it's easier to control the environment. And then, for example, robots can more or less behave well, machines or some automation, they can perform well rather than building autonomous robots that would be able to make decisions in a variable environment. So in that sense, classical engineering would favor getting humans out of the loop because we are, in some cases, the main source of perturbation and lack of predictability. So-called human factor. And of course, if we want to build robust artificial systems, then we should look at natural robust systems. And this is more general than stability, in the sense that robustness, uh, I mean, we'll see it's more about preserving functionality rather than just being in one state. A system can be very active and at the same time be robust because, let's say, its function can be very dynamic, but then if it keeps that function, then we can say it's robust. And also we can have different types of perturbations, functional, structural, material, and so on. So, of course, one system might be structurally robust, but functionally fragile for whatever reason. And it also depends on what kind of perturbation it might, let's say, affect or not the system. So it's difficult to say in general, oh, this system is robust, this system is fragile, because in most cases, systems are robust against some perturbations and they're not robust against other perturbations. For example, we are robust against certain changes of temperature. Let's say we can more or less survive between, I don't know, -40 and +50 or something like that, with, let's say, certain technologies will survive better. But for example, so we could say, oh, we are robust to changes of temperature in that range, but then let's say from -200 centigrade to +2000 centigrade, that's way too much. Or if we would have an atmosphere without oxygen, then also we are not robust to those changes of atmosphere. That might be drastic. But yeah, I remember also in engineering, or well, yeah, when I was an undergrad, that I was doing behavior-based systems, which is kind of uh, new artificial intelligence from the 1980s, as a response to good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, which was based more on reasoning and symbol manipulation. The idea was to build, well, these classic systems that are based in logic, they're very fragile because, let's say, if one statement is not true, then like everything can break down. And then these behavior-based systems inspired in ethology, as part of biology that studies animal behavior, observed how animals were very robust. And one of the things that was desirable in these so-called animats, or animated robots, either physically, let's say in hardware robots or virtual software agents, was that they would be robust, meaning that they would degrade gracefully. So basically, you would start chopping them off, and they don't stop working immediately, but let's say their functionality starts degrading gracefully, uh, meaning that it's not all of a sudden that it's you change something and then nothing works. Um, yeah. So there are many questions we can pose about robustness, what are its origin, how does it evolve, uh, whether redundancy, modularity, neutrality, hierarchy, degeneracy, spatial closure, diversification, and so on. How can they contribute to the robustness of systems? How can they be combined and so on? How they're related, what's their costs, and how robustness influences positively or negatively evolvability, adaptability, and fitness. When robustness is desirable and when it isn't, because let's say in many cases we want a fragile system to become robust, but in many cases we want a robot system to become fragile so that we can change it. So, for example, in a broken democracy, uh, I mean, I'm not suggesting any country in particular, but let's assume some countries have problems with politics. Uh, it's very difficult to change because, well, okay, let's speak about Mexico. There's lots of corruption and it's very robust, so it's difficult to change because like new politicians entering the system cannot change the system. The system changes the politicians and basically selects those that will work within the modus operandi on the status quo. Or the same, the drug cartels, it's very robust. About 500,000 Mexicans are direct employers from the cartels. So it's an important part of the Mexican economy depending directly on these criminal organizations. So not only they're robust, but if we would like to change the situation so that maybe not all of them, but let's say 80% of them would stop doing illegal activities. It's like, okay, where do you get 400,000 jobs that would be as high paying as being a hitman? I is not trivial, no? And let's say strategies like El Salvador just to put everybody in jail is not sustainable. I mean, we cannot put 400,000 people in jail just like that. And it won't solve the problem. They are robust because they have a recruiting system that has been active. So they lose people because of the same violence, but then they have ways of recruiting more people. So yeah, how to stop that? It's not trivial. And it's like, okay, how can we reduce the robustness of such systems? So below the gene level, let's say in molecules, there are several examples of robustness. So neutral landscapes. So you, you might have heard that in evolution, people speak about genotype and phenotype, meaning that genotype is how some function is encoded, and then the phenotype is precisely the function or the outcome of the genotype. And let's say the name comes from the genes encoding certain features in organisms, but the same concepts are used at the molecular level. So the genotype, let's say not only of genes, but let's say just sequence of amino acids for proteins would be, let's say the sequence of amino acids would be the genotype. Then the phenotype is just the function of the protein, which is basically given by the shape of the protein. So a neutral mutation is a change in the genotype that doesn't affect the phenotype. So if we mutate one gene and there's no change in the phenotype, then that's a neutral mutation. So neutral networks are basically when we have fitness landscape. So we have different variables that we can change in our genotype. So it's like highly dimensional space, but we can imagine just 2 dimensions so that we have a surface, and the fitness would be the height of the surface. And then mutations can take us up or down or keep the same altitude on this landscape. So a neutral mutation would keep the same altitude. Basically, it's not a decrease in fitness. And when the genotype space is multidimensional, then it becomes easier to find one path because you can move in multiple dimensions. Basically, every gene that you can mutate, it's a different dimension you can move. So it's not only easy, but at any point in the genotype space you are, there will be mutations that will be neutral, basically, that don't change the phenotype. So this can be used by evolution to navigate or to explore the genotype space without changing the phenotype. So that gives the possibility of evolution, because if in order to find a better evolutionary solution, you will need to decrease your fitness, then that can be problematic. So, for example, in RNA folding, neutral networks percolate the entire genotype space, and that there are always neutral point mutations. So, RNA are single strands of ribonucleic acid, have 4 different base pairs, and they fold in different shapes. And for any RNA sequence, there will be point mutation. So you can go from almost any point to any point in the genotype space, navigating these point mutations. Not only that, but all phenotypes are very close to any given sequence. Since there's lots of redundancy among sequences, meaning that different genotypes will give you the same phenotype. Let's say they will fall into the same shape. If you want a function, basically a shape in which the RNA folds, then you can get it starting from different sequences. So it's relatively easy to find with an evolutionary search. And the same happens with protein folding. So instead of having 4 different bases, proteins have 21 amino acids. And it's similar to RNA that you have neutral networks percolating the whole genetic space. So yeah, there's also modularity, which helps with the robustness of the proteins. And then about the gene level, there's also robustness in development. So when we have multicellular organisms developing from single cells, then that embryogenesis or that epigenesis is very robust. There is possibility of changing, let's say you remove some of the cells early in the embryonic development, and the embryo in many cases manages to recover. And also there's robustness in metabolic pathways, in metabolic networks at the cell level. So for example, if there's a mutation that affects one of the elements of these metabolic networks, then there are other alternatives so that, let's say, a single mutation will not make life unviable in most cases. There are very few single point mutations that will basically make unviable a cell, that it wouldn't be able to function. And then beyond organisms, there's also plenty of examples of robustness. So in ecology, there are similar concepts, resilience and stability, and more recently, sustainability, that are related to robustness. So for example, food webs they tend to be robust. There's these keystone species that if you remove them from an ecosystem, then it collapses, but then most ecosystems manage to recover anyway, and then they adapt. And let's say usually there are many species, and then there are some redundancy in some ecosystems, and that's why diversity is important for ecology, because the more diversity you have, then if one species is removed, the probability that, let's say, its removal will lead to the removal of other species is reduced, because then there are other species that can occupy that niche. And homeostasis, it's also a concept related with robustness. Originally, Cannon, Walter Cannon, who was the teacher of Arturo Rosenbluth, used the term to explain how, for example, bodies maintain their own temperature, their salinity levels, their I mean, there are so many variables that organisms regulate, and he calls this homeostasis. It's an active process, but allows organisms to keep on living in variable environments. But then people speak also about planetary homeostasis, meaning that it has been shown that planets can actually regulate their own temperature. There's this Daisy World model. It's in NetLogo if you want to play with it. And then also there's this, yeah, so actually Daisy World is at the bottom. That's precisely about planetary homeostasis. Let's see. And also Peter Chermely has this book on weak links, and it's like the complement of modularity. So modularity, I mean, is when you have some elements that are better connected than others, and then those that are highly connected among themselves, you call them modules or communities. And then that helps with robustness for systems, because when you have just few connections between modules, the probability that perturbation will propagate from one module to a different one is reduced. And weak links are precisely, when you have weak links in a system, it's basically the other side of the coin of modularity. And then let's say you can focus either on modularity or in weak links. That also comes more from social science. Yeah, there's a reading like in 3 weeks of Granovetter about weak links. So in artificial systems, we have also examples of robustness. So the internet, peer-to-peer systems, ad hoc networks. We already mentioned some robust social systems that are difficult to change even if we want them to. And question whether there can be a robust economy that can resist uh, financial shocks. I mean, it depends also on how you define robustness in an economy. We could say that economies are robust, even because their patterns are so chaotic. So in spite of having crises, say countries keep on more or less growing, uh, even if there are periods where economies can collapse. And actually, this is related to anti-fragility, so we will return to this. And then network science has also shown what kind of structure is more robust than others. So, for example, scale-free networks are robust to random attacks, but they're fragile to directed attacks to hubs. So, for example, in a airport network, LaGuardia Airport was closed yesterday because of a crash, and let's say it's not a small airport, but it's also not the largest in the United States. So let's say that didn't affect that many airports. If you have to shut down, I don't know, JFK or Atlanta or Houston, then it's the end of the world. Well, it has much larger impact than if you close Binghamton Airport. No? Nobody will notice. So, for example, how can you improve the robustness? One option is to have connections between all hubs. So then, if one of the hubs is say malfunctioning or shut down, then other hubs can take part of that function. Another would be to have duplicates. So of course this is expensive, but in internet networks it makes sense to have the main nodes that control traffic to have uh, redundancy in those nodes. Uh, Hubs could also be hidden or could also be changing, so then it would be more difficult to attack them. Okay. I forgot, did we see random Boolean networks this class? Yeah. So, I mean, I'll present them briefly because with this we can speak better about robustness and anti-fragility. So, we can see them as generalizations of cellular automata. Originally, they were proposed by Stuart Kaufman in '69 as models of genetic regulatory networks. One has random connectivity and functionality. And basically, we have n nodes with k inputs on average. And these are generated randomly, how they are connected. So, for example, we have these nodes, and then they represent genes, so they can be on or off, so they can take values of 0 or 1, so like in cellular automata, only that each one has a different neighborhood. So, for example, this node is affected by its neighbors, but then this one is affected by this one and this one. And you can see that, for example, this node doesn't affect other nodes, and then this node affects many other nodes, including itself. So yeah, you generate randomly this connectivity matrix, and then you usually keep it fixed. And then the functionality is defined with lookup tables. So for example, for this node O, you consider all the possible states of its inputs, and then you generate also randomly the function, which in this case will be XNOR or something like that. And let's say here would be a random initial state of, I don't know, maybe 32 nodes, and then time is flowing to the right. Quickly, you see a regular pattern arising. So one color represents 0, another represents ones. So we have state space, which is basically how one state leads to the next. So the structure is given by this topological network, which is n nodes of 1 bit. And the function is given by the state network, which is 2 to the n nodes of n bits each. So of course, this is huge. And in many cases, you cannot explore it exhaustively. So once you reach a state that you already visited, you know that you're in an attractor because it's a deterministic system. So you will start repeating states. You can have point attractors, meaning that it's just one state repeating indefinitely, or cycle attractors, which is subset of states. So for example, here, let's say there's a attractor of period 4. Each of these nodes represents like the whole state of the network. Since it's deterministic, all the nodes have only one successor. So this gives us dissipative systems in the sense that many states lead to few states, because Some states can have many predecessors. Some states will have no predecessor. These are known as Garden of Eden states because you can only reach them from initial conditions. And like this, the dynamic converges into the attractors. So we call all the states that lead to an attractor the basin of the attractor. And then here again we can explore the question of the relationship between structure and function, because structure is given by the topological network and function by the state network. So what happens when you change, let's say, this link, instead of connecting here, you connected it there? Or what happens if you flip this bit in the lookup table? Instead of 0, you put 1. How does that alter the state space? And yeah, it's non-trivial. There's no general answer. But yeah, there are some things we know. Like, for example, you have more connectivity, the dynamic tends to be more chaotic. So k equals 1, this is on average, each node has one input. You have ordered dynamics. These are very robust. Most nodes are static. We have convergence of similar states, meaning that if there's a perturbation here, most probably the next state will take you back into the attractor, and similar states converge to the same states very quickly. So we can see here that, let's say, the transient of this initial state into the attractor is relatively quick. Another extreme, when we have lots of connectivity, we have chaotic dynamics or pseudo-chaotic dynamics, and there seems to be no general pattern. It's like white noise. There are attractors, but I mean, the state spaces are so huge that you can be, let's say, all the time in the universe going through a transient without reaching the attractor. And most nodes are changing. You have fragility, you have divergence of similar states, meaning that if you suddenly change one state here, one node, then that change very probably would propagate through all the network, and then you would very quickly end up in a completely different state as opposed to the original dynamics. So this is one definition of chaos. So these are fragile. And in between, we have criticality. It's a balance between those two extremes. Some nodes change, some nodes don't change. Usually changes spread locally. And this gives us some nice properties like maximization of information storage, coherent information transfer, Fisher information. And Stuart Kaufman and Chris Langton and others in the early 90s were arguing that precisely we need critical dynamics to have life and computation, because in evolution, if you have ordered dynamics, then you cannot adapt because there's a mutation and then it's neutral, so there's no change in the phenotype. You cannot evolve, you cannot adapt. However, if you have chaotic dynamics, then a small change will destroy all the good features that you had already accumulated. So somewhere in between is where life should be. And it was only in 2008 that there was already evidence from real genetic regulatory networks that real genetic regulatory networks are close to critical, also in the order regime, and we will see why in a moment. So yeah, the thing is that here you have balance between robustness, information storage and variability, computation and exploration. So for computation is the same thing. If you have order or robust dynamics, then you cannot really compute anything because there's no change. If you have chaotic dynamics, you can compute some things, but then usually you will lose information because of this sensitivity. And here you can keep some information, so you can have memory, but at the same time you can do some computation. So, wow, already 20 years ago, we studied what's the effect of adding redundant nodes to random Mooreland network. So we choose at random one node, and then we duplicate it. So we add another node. We put the same inputs, the same lookup table as this X node. So here is just the same. And then the outputs of X will also receive inputs from R. So we expand these lookup tables so that when this node was on, then if this is on, it will have the same functionality. So, for example, here we can see that it was NAND. This is a NAND function. So what we do here is that, okay, if X was 1, then we don't care about. So we look at this part of the lookup table, and then if this R is 1, then we will have the same lookup table than when X was 1, and when both are 1, then we will have again the same lookup table. So we take half of the lookup table. So here we do the same. So for example, here, when X is 1, let's say we have this 1, 0, and then when R is 1, it's the same 1, 0. And when both are 1, is the same 1, 0. So we basically add an OR X or R, then it will give the same function that was before. So it's like very simple heuristics. And then as we add nodes, well, the thing is that we also increase the connectivity. So the state space is also increased. So the difference in state spaces seem to be reduced, but then we normalize it by the number of connections. Then we see that the differences in the state space as we add red nodes becomes less and less, especially when the networks are more and more chaotic. So yeah, this would be the average connectivity of the network. This is the number of redundant nodes in the network. I think these are networks just with 7 nodes. Yeah. So what happens is that mutations in redundant nodes do not propagate that much through the networks. We also tried having redundant links, but then these are fictitious, so they're basically useless redundancy. You can say that useful redundancy smoothens rough fitness landscapes. But then if you have too much redundancy, you might have a slower evolutionary search. So if you already have smooth landscape, then there's no need to add redundancy. So there's this other property called degeneracy, which is related but different to redundancy. So it happens when different elements of a system have the same function. So we implemented also in random Boolean networks degeneracy, and what we found is that it also makes more robust the dynamics, but in a different way. So actually, if you have redundancy and degeneracy, your networks will be even more robust. Okay. Any question until now? Okay, so let's go to anti-fragility. And this concept was proposed by Nassim Taleb a bit more than 10 years ago, a book with the same name. And he asked people, oh, what's the opposite of fragility? And most people say, oh, well, robustness. And he was like um, unsatisfied with this idea because he noticed that robustness is not so much the opposite of fragility, but the lack of fragility. Because, for example, if you send something fragile by mail, say some crystal cups, then you try to protect it, put things to prevent perturbations, and then you put a label fragile, do not shake, do not smash, because otherwise it will be broken. The function will be destroyed. If we send something robust by posts, let's say rocks or logs, and we don't really care with how they're handled, so we don't put any label. And if they are handled with care or not, it's the same thing. So the function is preserved. So the rocks will still be rocks. But then if we would send something anti-fragile by posts, then we would put a label, please shake, because then if it's mishandled, it would reach its destination in better condition than if it was treated with care. And it might sound counterintuitive, but I mean, there are several examples of anti-fragility. So one is the immune system, in the sense that it benefits from mild infections. So it's known that babies who were raised in a highly sterile environments and their immune system was not exercised, so later they have higher probability of having allergies and stronger reactions to disease. And vaccines that were developed in Africa, and then they reached Europe through the Ottoman Empire. In the 18th century, it is the same principle. So we get like a weakened version of an infectious agent, and then that allows the immune system to get ready, and then it becomes immune to the infection. And actually, exercise is another example of antifragility, because when we have cardiovascular activity, we breathe more oxygen. So in principle, our cells should oxidize faster, and therefore we should age faster the more exercise we do. However, our body produces antioxidants, and this overcompensates the increased oxygen intake. So the overall effect is rejuvenating. If we run 1 marathon per day, then that is, let's say, aging our cells more, because then there's not enough antioxidants. And this can be as a particular case of hormesis. Um, Anyone recognize this guy? That's Rasputin. And there's this myth, or well, legend. I don't know. It's well, he was advisor to the Russian Tsar Nicholas II, or better said, to his wife, to the Tsarina, and other nobles did not like the influence he had. So basically, they plotted to kill him. So they invited him to Sheremetev's palace in St. Petersburg by the Molka River. Uh, and they gave him some cake with cyanide, which is basically rat poison. And legend says that he just ate it gladly and had no effect. So then he was shot, but then nothing happened to him, and then he was drowned, and well, okay, so finally he was killed. But that doesn't really matter. There's this idea that if you have small amounts of cyanide, then you become resistant to cyanide. Disclaimer, kids, don't try this at home. uh, but actually, there's this idea that, but it's an example of hormesis. That's uh, the idea of hormesis. I saw some paper claiming that there might be some evidence that radiation, small doses of radiation, are useful to make organisms more resistant to cancer, but it's not proven. And very probably different organisms would benefit from different levels of radiation. And in some cases, it might be that they would create tumors where there wouldn't be any. So, see, again, kids, don't try this at home. Don't get radiated. But then the idea of antifragility has been permeating the different disciplines. So in software development, there's this idea of basically having agents that will perturb your system. So it will basically test for weaknesses. And it's useful before deployment to have those tests. and then your system will be uh, better deployed if they had these perturbations during development. Uh, and yeah, we're very Russian today. Uh, um, so this quote from War and Peace, I it has to do with creativity, because if we have like all the same things and no perturbations, then it's very difficult to have some innovation. And this has to do also with creativity, with serendipity, in the sense that in many cases, new ideas come from the unexpected, from perturbations. So if we, let's say, in that sense, creativity itself is anti-fragile. And if we would prevent these perturbations, we would be inhibiting creativity. And then there's um, noise, which is type of perturbation. Uh, and then there are a few papers where they discuss um, positive role of noise and error in complex systems, and also in collective intelligence, because let's say some uh, classical thinkers like Daniel Kahneman and Cal Sustein, they were arguing that noise should be eliminated in social systems because it was destructive. And then the argument is like it can also have beneficial effects like Schumpeterian destruction. Well, this idea in economy that in some cases, when you have some destruction, it can be have a positive long-term effect because it opens niches that wouldn't be open if there wasn't a crisis. Um, and for example, in Hopfield networks, uh, they classify better if there's some noise in their environment. But then, of course, if there's too much noise, then they don't classify as well. And then it becomes a bit of a tricky question. Okay, what's the optimal level of noise for a Hopfield network? And most probably it depends on the problem you're trying to solve. So it's like a hyperparameter problem. And probably you have heard this expression, don't rest on your laurels, which was seen as a sign of victory in ancient Rome, meaning that if, let's say, even if you have the most powerful army in the world, if you're just scratching your belly, you are just, let's say, uh, letting things degrade on their own. So, in a sense, the perturbations can be useful to keep a system active and adaptive and fit and strong. And if the system is just like, oh, I'm perfect, I don't need to do anything, usually that's the sure path to degradation. And in Mexico, we have aguas frescas, which is translation of fresh water. So uh, most popular are Jamaica, which is hibiscus infusion with sugar, horchata, which is rice with cinnamon, and tamarind, which is this fruit. Um, well, you know tamarind. I'm preaching to the choir. But let's say when you take the pulp of the tamarind, especially mixed with sugar, then it just goes all the way down. So you need to shake it so that it's tasty. So these are also anti-fragile, because if you don't perturb it, then it goes all the pulp goes down, and then you sip it, and it has no flavor, and at the end it's all bitter because it has too much tamarind. So and my eldest daughter noticed this example that when you cut grass, it's also antifragile because it grows better after you perturb it. And there's a relationship with self-organized criticality. Uh, so for example, in forest fires, if you prevent small forest fires from occurring, then you accumulate um, you accumulate um, combustible mass, so more and more trees. And then when a fire is large enough, then it's almost impossible to control because there's so much combustible that's accumulated for decades. So, in a sense, already some rangers understand this, so they do control fires uh, that make forests more robust to fires. So, yeah. It's another example. If you try to protect a forest, oh, poor forests, you're so vulnerable, there shouldn't be any fire. Then you let all the trees grow, and then it becomes really fragile. And just a small fire, just and you can't stop it. Uh, but then again, sometimes these control fires go out of control, and then you have problem because it's like, oh yeah, we were expecting that there would be rain soon, and the wind wouldn't blow, and whatever, and then things change. And so Taleb proposed a measure of anti-fragility, but at the time there were two postdocs working with me, and they were PhDs in mathematics, and they couldn't understand the measure, and I didn't understand the measure. So it's like, okay, let's just propose our own simple measure. And it's very simple. This is a measure of fragility. So delta sigma is a change of satisfaction of a system. So it's basically how much of a function is fulfilled. Um, so let's say this can be an arbitrary amount between 1 and 0. So 1 means that the system functions perfectly, 0 that doesn't function at all. And then we can see a perturbation delta x. Again, we can normalize it between 0 and 1. And then depending on that perturbation x, if the satisfaction increases or decreases. So if the satisfaction decreases, then we can say that the system is fragile. If the satisfaction increases with the change, then we can say it's anti-fragile. So then this would be negative. Okay, so if this decreases, then this is negative, and then this would be positive. There would be fragility. If this is negative, sorry, if this is positive, then this would be negative. Then this would be anti-fragility. So we analyze with one of these postdocs who was a mathematician, and another colleague back in Mexico, data from stocks and cryptocurrencies, because Taleb was suggesting that in an economy it would be better anti-fragile rather than robust. So we just checked, oh, are stocks and cryptocurrencies anti-fragile or robust? And we found that the successful cryptocurrencies and stocks tend to be robust rather than anti-fragile. So, well, here's anti-fragility. So then this will be anti-fragile and this will be fragile. And this is how much they increase their price. And those that are successful are closer to value of 0, meaning that they're robust. And our hypothesis for explaining this is that if you have this, well, in stock markets and cryptocurrencies, you have perturbations at multiple scales. So it's all, and you can't predict them. So it would be highly unlikely that you could have a strategy that would exploit changes of all sizes, say perturbations at multiple scales, in order to get a benefit from those perturbations. So it seems that in this situation, the best strategy is to be robust and basically don't be affected by the small and big changes in the market. And is reflected in these results. And for stocks, it's very similar. And then for random Euler networks, we also studied what's the effect on perturbations. We basically flip a certain number of nodes every certain number of time steps. And the satisfaction is a change of complexity. So let's say this is a proxy for criticality. So we assume that random Mooreland networks or these networks want to be critical, and the more critical they are, then the higher the satisfaction. So we basically see whether adding perturbations to a network increases the criticality / complexity of the networks or not. And what we see is that, let's say here for different connectivities, if they are ordered, here it's the number of nodes that are perturbed every time step. And here we perturb 40 nodes every O time steps. But we can just focus on this. So basically here, the x-axis is number of nodes perturbed, and this is the fragility. So we see that for k equals 1, we have antifragility. So order dynamics are antifragile, meaning that when you add more perturbations, more noise, then these networks become more complex. So basically they move towards the phase transition. But then when you add too much perturbations, then they already become chaotic, and then they become fragile. So here for k equals 2, that's what happens. And then for real biological networks, we see that they're mainly antifragile. So most of them are ordered. And then the explanation, because this is the same that was found almost 20 years ago when data started becoming available about real genetic regulatory networks, is that if you want to be critical, but then there's some perturbations in your environment, if you are perfectly critical, then those perturbations will make you chaotic. And that's why it makes sense to be close to critical, but on the order phase, so that with the perturbations in the environment, with level of noise, then you will become critical. And then we see here that the least antifragile networks are Arabidopsis, which is a plant network which has really lots of redundancy, so they don't really need to be that antifragile because they're very robust. And cancer and on death, apoptosis. So these all these three that are the least antifragile seem not well. It makes sense that they shouldn't care about perturbations of their environment because they have like their own internal dynamics. And then these other cell types, like immune cell, is the most antifragile because it's exposed to most variability. Because it has to detect different pathogens and then make different decisions. So it's exposed to lots of noise. So it makes sense that it's the most antifragile / ordered. So because it will face most perturbations. So the more antifragile, then the more perturbations will be necessary to take it to criticality. And we also show that multi-layer structure promotes antifragility. So when you have multiple scale networks, so you have some networks representing cells, then some other networks representing tissues, then that increases the fragility as well of the networks. And then we also show that, I mean, in random Mooreland networks, you can measure robustness and evolvability, but it's extremely expensive computationally. And it turns out that antifragility is very easy to measure, and then you can use antifragility as a proxy for inferring whether a random Mooreland network is robust and evolvable. And we also apply this to ecosystems, something that is also being adopted in ecology. So the question is like, okay, what should we prefer, robustness or antifragility? What do you think?
That's the use case.
Yep. In many cases, it depends on how variable the environment is and how predictable that variability is. And also what would be the cost of just building robustness, or what would be the cost of building anti-fragility. So yeah. And in many cases, it will be even better to have both at the same time. Uh, but I mean, it's something that is very new. It's something that we are just starting to understand. Um, and it will be useful also to explore in different contexts these concepts. Because let's say I mentioned, for example, ecology. These concepts have been or are being studied there, but for example, in social systems, not so much. Uh, in economy a bit, but so not so much. Okay. Questions?
Would robustness be the point where it's zero? That graph you said negatives anti-fragile, positives fragile. So zero is exactly.
Yep. Yep. Robustness would be zero zero fragility, or values close to zero. Yeah. Okay, so I apologize that I didn't upload to Brightspace the readings for Thursday. But please try to read for next class one of these. And let's say if you don't have time to upload your summary, it's okay. You can upload it Friday or Saturday. But yeah, it would be useful to have a nice discussion about these texts that are related to information. So next week is spring break, and then right after spring break, there's Easter Monday. So then the Tuesday, I think the 7th. Yeah, it's Monday classes, so we will meet until the 9th. So I already put all the readings for the rest of the semester, so you can let's say see which ones will be. And also on Thursday, if you have any questions about your projects, we can go through them. And if you have preliminary results, it would be great also if you can share what you have. And yeah, I think that's all.
So now I think the slide before anti-fragility, you mentioned degeneracy.
Yes. Yes. So degeneracy, well, has more than one definition, but we can say that it's when multiple components of a system have the same function. So it's related to robustness. So in redundancy, you have multiple copies. So if one breaks down, you have just one quick replacement. However, if you have a perturbation that affects all the elements that are the same, then all your copies will be affected by that perturbation. So then degeneracy can be useful because it's like, for example, you have different ways of reaching the same destination. So for example, you can go from A to B by metro, by bus, by Uber, by bike, walking. So if there's a disruption in one of those, then the other system can still take you there, even if it's not so comfortable, efficient, and so on. So that would be degeneracy in the system. Yeah, that you have multiple components that allow you to transport yourself in this case. So yeah, if the whole metro system is shut down or the whole airspace is shut down, then you can still move by land. Mhm. Okay, so there's Coco seminar at 12:15. Come for the pizza, stay for the science. Well, I mean, the pizza is nothing special, so I shouldn't be overselling it. You might be disappointed, but yeah. it will be interesting. And on Thursday, there's also a seminar. And you can also watch it online, and later it's available on Vimeo. If you go to coco.binghamton.edu. Okay.